Everybody wants a better standard of living. They want better education, they want better health, they want better security in the country, defense, and they want better roads, they want better transport, all that kind of thing. How is that going to be afforded?
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Scottish entrepreneur Simon Miln on building a better society and the impact of corporate lobbying.
There's a huge amount of influence from big business in what goes on in our country in terms of political decisions. That to me is a major issue right now. It has been for a long time, but I think it's getting worse.
We also talk about the prospect of an independent Scotland.
For me, it's simply about economics. If an independent Scotland could be better off than it is in the Union, I would give it serious consideration. I'm not convinced about that.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Simon Miln, Scottish entrepreneur and business leader. Simon, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Lee. Good to meet you.
So it's been 4 years since the COVID lockdowns. We don't really talk about it so much anymore. Seems a lot of things are blamed on Brexit and Ukraine, but I think we should still be discussing it really. So as someone who was leading a business during that time, what impact did you see the lockdowns having?
At the time, it became significant quite quickly, but I think the damage that it's done has become more apparent as we move forward. I mean, the lockdowns really, when you look back, were completely undemocratic. I mean, it was one of the worst things I think that's happened to British society, certainly in my lifetime. The biggest issue I have with it really was, apart from the fact that they did it, is the fact that it was based on effectively a lie. It was based on information that, quite frankly, was spurious. And looking back on it now, it just seems incredible that we as a nation were so happy, most of us, to comply. And I include myself in that group. There were some people who, for one reason or another, whether they just were able to perceive what was going on quicker than other people. Interestingly, a lot of women, I think, saw this for what it was before a lot of men did. It's just an observation. I mean, a lot of it's not as if lockdown happened and it's finished and we all move on. The impact of lockdown is still with us. The most obvious part of it was the economic impact, and lockdown. You cannot effectively close down a country in terms of its economy, all but the essential components of it, to close it down for months on end and not expect a gigantic bill at the end of it, which is what we have. I mean, we talk about a cost of living crisis, and the politicians will tell us that it's all down to Putin invading Ukraine, as well as other things that have been going on in the last 3 or 4 years. But we can't get away from the fact that, as far as this country is concerned, our economy was more or less switched off. It affected my business hugely. We went through a period of perhaps almost 6 months where we simply had zero turnover. You can't survive as a business in those circumstances. So a lot of businesses sadly did go under. But the government's response to a lot of this was, specifically to lockdown, was furlough. Yeah. There is no such thing as government money. It's taxpayers' money. You'd have thought that we would have seen that money being requested from the British people in the form of taxation, but the government effectively short-circuited that by simply going and printing money, which is effectively writing checks for future generations. So we've got this massive national debt now as a consequence of not just lockdown, but all the things that happened during COVID. when you think of all the measures that the government put into place, all the contracts that were placed for PPE, which some of it was, I believe, actually quite a lot of it was destroyed recently because it was never used or it wasn't up to standard. A lot of it wasn't required in the first place. The huge amounts that were invested into track and trace, into the vaccines, so much of this was just completely unjustified. So yeah, here we are 4 years on, and we've got a very serious economic situation in the country. Not just in this country, but throughout a lot of the Western world anyway.
And what effect do you think all of this had on people's trust in the government and science and the structure of our society, really?
That's an interesting question, because I think it depends on who you are, what kind of person you are. I still see there's a lot of people who have just simply complied, will conform with whatever the government or the establishment. When I say the government and the establishment, I'm talking about, you mentioned doctors, the NHS, the scientists behind all the advice that was given to us. There are still too many people who just find it a lot more comfortable, I guess, to accept the narrative. But what I would say is that I think that the small group of people who initially resisted all of this has grown. Definitely, it's grown. I think there's a much larger group of people who have seen through what happened. And you mentioned lockdowns at the start. I don't know whether the government would try that again, whether it was for another virus or for some other reason. But I would say right now, if they did, I think there's going to be far, far more opposition and resistance to any government, whether it's from Westminster or up where I'm from in Scotland, trying to introduce or to mandate that kind of thing. I think there will be a hell of a kickback, which didn't happen last time round.
What are your thoughts on the role the media played throughout the pandemic?
Shocking. Absolutely. I'm talking about the mainstream media. Absolutely shocking. Because ultimately, ordinary people get their information from primarily still the television, more and more from social media. Certainly the younger generation are looking at their phones and their other devices. But essentially what we think we know about what's going on in our country or indeed in the world is what's being told to us effectively by the media. So when you look back at how everything was so distorted right from the start, the media has to take responsibility for that. I don't think they will, but I think the role that the media played, and I think part of it was down to design. I think there was definitely people behind the scenes who were manipulating the news, which there always is. This is nothing new, but I think it's being taken to a new level. I think technology is allowing this to now to be taken to a new level, a new frightening level actually. But the role of a journalist should be to investigate and impartially share that news with the general public. But that's not what happened. So I think we have a very serious problem with the independence of the media in not just this country, but in certainly probably actually all around the world. I think that is a problem because it's such a powerful tool. If you're in power, when I say in power, I'm not talking necessarily if you're in government, because I do think there's greater powers than the government. But whoever is in control of the media does effectively control what's going on in the world. So it's hugely powerful, and with that power should come a huge amount of responsibility and accountability. That's not happening.
So what are your thoughts on the future of Scotland? Would you support another independence referendum?
I don't think now is the right time for that, quite frankly. I've got mixed views about Scottish independence. I am generally in support of the Union. The problem I have with that is pretty much the same problem that I had with the European Union as well. Cooperation and working together is, in theory, a a very good idea, and it is. There's all sorts of benefits that we could potentially have had from staying in the European Union, and I would argue the same thing for Scotland as well. The problem I have with Europe, and this really goes back actually to the whole COVID thing as well, and that is that to see how undemocratic the European Union turned out to be put me right off. Again, very much, in fact, not dissimilar to how the SNP were behaving in Scotland. And I wanted to pull away from that. Now, with in Scotland, I did, for the first time, I did actually think when things were getting really at the height of COVID, I did think that if the Scottish government had come out and said, right, we're not buying into any of this. We're not going to go down the route that Westminster's gone down. We're not going to lock down. We're not going to close schools. We're not going to have any kind of push for vaccines. I could have potentially bought into Scottish independence at that point. For me, the biggest problem with Scottish independence, for me, it's not an emotional thing at all. The whole connection with the history, and that to me isn't the reason that I would either support or go against Scottish independence. For me, it's simply about economics. If an independent Scotland could be better off than it is in the Union, I would give it serious consideration. I've never been convinced about that. There are huge issues with Scotland being independent, economic issues. But of course, there are things that are more important than the economy.
Do you see the need for a new political party in Scotland?
Yes, quite frankly, because interestingly, I think the SNP is now a spent force. I'm not saying they couldn't come back, but I think that they've damaged themselves so badly that I don't think they are going to fare well in the next Scottish elections. But the problem is with Scotland, and this has been a problem for a long, long time, the Conservatives in Scotland, the brand is just unacceptable. Most Scots just will not vote Conservative. That's not altogether true, because there has been moments where the Conservatives have gained a little bit of ground, but the Conservatives, I don't think, would ever be popular in Scotland. I just can't see that. I think the brand, again, is been so badly damaged over the last few decades. I think there is a need for another party. Labour has effectively moved into the SNP territory in Scotland. I've got absolutely no time for Labour at all. So that, for me personally, that's not the solution. We do need another party. The problem is where does that party, where does it come from? We've seen in the general election, we've seen Reform, okay, they only won 5 seats, but there was a lot of people who voted for Reform.
Yeah, more than 4 million, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a big number. I mean, that's challenging the Lib Dems, and who got far more seats. I don't know the exact number, but they got a lot of seats. Now, I think Reform has some potential in Scotland, but I think there are issues with that. I think the brand, again, needs to be looked at. I think the personalities involved, and what it potentially offers for Scotland as well, because the independence question is not going to go away. You asked that earlier about my view on that, and I don't think now is the right time, but you can't ignore it either. I think what you've got to try and do is address it, but do it in a responsible way, and be as open and as frank with the people of Scotland as you can be. And that means sharing information which is based on fact rather than politics. If you look at the last referendum, a lot of the people who voted yes, I don't really believe understood the consequences if that vote had gone through, if it had actually been a success for the yes campaign. I don't think they really understood what they were in for.
You mean more economic consequences?
Economic, yeah, absolutely.
You've said before that corporate lobbying is the biggest problem the UK faces, at least politically. Can you talk us through that?
I touched on this earlier about who's actually controlling the government. It's very tempting to, and rightly so, to criticise the Conservatives for the last few years of them being in government. But you have to bear in mind that I don't think that any prime minister or any minister gets to do what they perhaps really would like to do in government. I think the realities of the machinery of government and what's behind the scenes, what you see is in Westminster is in the House of Commons are debates going on and key issues being discussed. But what actually makes whatever decisions are made there come into effect in the country, there's a huge machinery behind the scenes. That machinery works at its own pace. And I think it's also influenced by people who are involved in operating that machinery. I'm talking about the civil service. And then behind that as well, you've got a lot of corporate lobbying. There's a huge amount of influence from big business in what goes on in our country in terms of political decisions. That to me is a major issue right now. It has been for a long time, but I think it's getting worse because ultimately the people that we vote into Westminster, our MPs, are supposed to represent us, the people. But what I'm seeing more and more of is that once they get into those positions, and particularly once they get into government, they start to represent other interests, in particular people who are throwing money at them. And we're talking about businesses. We touched on the media earlier. The media is controlled, the mainstream media in this country is controlled by a very small group of people. That gives them extraordinary power. The same thing goes in terms of any kind of corporate lobbying, is that the way that government policy is shaped and decisions are made is so heavily influenced by money rather than what it should be in terms of what the people of the country actually want. So I think we've got to, ideally, if we could separate politics from that the business world, I think we would have a far better government. That's a lot easier said than done. I think that's a very, very big challenge, and I'm not quite sure how you do it. There's people beginning to wake up to this whole concept, and I think that's how the Conservatives have ended up where they are today, and why you've got parties like, for example, Reform coming to the front, who are actually challenging some of these ideals that are currently in British politics.
People are concerned about a deteriorating Britain. If we look at the election results, it seems a lot of it was defined by people refusing to vote for the party that they feel has presided over 14 years of that. And what do you think, what changes need to come about for us to build a better society?
One of the key things that we've got to do is actually focus on wealth creation, because without wealth, nothing is possible. And if you look at all the great institutions that we have had as a country, and we still do have some of these which are still there in some shape or form, but they've come about through Britain's wealth. If you look at all the great things, for example, the NHS, which is a hugely expensive institution, but it's come about from Britain being a wealthy country. And how did Britain get its wealth? It got its wealth through industry and through colonization as well. Let's not forget that. And there's a lot of shame at the moment attached to that. I don't feel that way. I think that if you go back in history, there's been every country has at some point tried to colonize another country or behave in that way. But Britain was incredibly successful in building up a massive empire. What you've now got to look at is to say, well, okay, everybody wants all these things. Everybody wants a better standard of living. They want better education. They want better health. They want better security in the country, defense, and they want better roads. They want better transport, all that kind of thing. How is that going to be afforded? How are you going to pay for all of those things? You can't just simply print money, or you can't continue to do that, because that's just kicking the can down the road. Eventually that is going to lead to a problem where you realize that you actually can't fund it. I would say you've got to concentrate on wealth creation. And one of the biggest obstacles to that at the moment for me is the whole drive towards net zero. To me, I think we are destroying Britain's economy with this. I am absolutely a true environmentalist. I believe I am anyway. But for me, what's going on at the moment, not just in this country, but throughout the world, it's all about virtue signaling. It's all about buying an electric car, for example, or closing down a power station and not looking at nuclear, but looking at things like wind. And that's all very well, but is it going to work? Is it actually going to create the power that we need to drive the economy? Is it actually better for the environment than the alternatives? But nobody wants to ask those questions. It's the whole drive towards net zero, the whole climate change subject has almost taken on a religious quality. It's not something that's open for debate anymore. And that I find really quite troubling. I'm not a scientist, so if people can come up with reasons to do one thing or another, but you've got to bear in mind, you've got to balance that with what's going on in the country in terms of its economy. Britain's a very, very small player now in the world. When you look at the impact that we have on the world's environment, it's very small. When you look at what, for example, China's impact on the environment, and yet China's not going down the same route that Britain is. China is still opening new coal-fired power stations. And yet we are obsessed, we seem to be obsessed with this whole drive towards net zero. What we do know for certain is that it is going to have a massive impact on our economy. And people talk about all the opportunities in renewables and things. I'm just not convinced about that. I just see a huge deficit appearing. So going back to your original question, I think that the first thing I would want to look at would be how to create wealth, how to generate wealth. That's because with that, other things become possible.
Do you think people have a clear enough understanding of how life's going to be if we keep pushing net zero and how much it's going to affect their own personal wealth?
No, I don't think. I mean, your average man in the street, average man and woman in the street, do not really dwell, I think, on politics. And that's not a criticism because it's just the reality of life. Most people are actually too busy surviving, getting by, simply putting food on the table. I don't think that the average person has the time to investigate and research what's going on in the world. But I do think it's important that we try and get people to engage more. You're not going to turn someone who doesn't spend any time on politics into someone who's going to spend all their time on, because they've got jobs to do, quite frankly. But you just want people to be more interested in what's going on, how it's going to affect not just them but their children and potentially their children's children, and just have a society that's just more interested in what's going on and not just accepting what the television is telling them, what the government is telling them, and just simply to conform. I think that's what we've got to try and change. And I think there is hope of doing that. And I think that comes through perhaps the younger generation. That's why I'm interested in this idea of actually bringing more younger people into politics. When I say into politics, I'm talking just being more aware of politics and getting them to vote, ultimately to go down and actually put a cross on a ballot paper. I think that's so important. Interestingly, we've got a system in this country which we talk about democracy, but I'm not entirely convinced that we do have democracy as everyone thinks we do. I have been speaking to people recently about a system that's perhaps more similar to the one they have in Switzerland, where you've got direct democracy. And that requires people to be more engaged, because what you're doing there is you're reducing central government, and you're reducing the role of central government, and you're actually putting more responsibility onto the people. So they are being asked to decide what to do on key issues. Now that also opens up a whole different debate. But I think it's a very interesting one, because it does mean that people have actually got to think about something which is going to affect their lives.
So you're saying there's more referendums on key issues?
Yeah. It's right. I mean, I'm not. I've been to Switzerland quite recently. I'm not an expert on Swiss politics, but the direct democracy they have is that they do get the people get to vote on key issues. Yeah. So, for example, we have things like net zero, supporting the war in Ukraine. These are all very, very important issues. But it's not something that the people get to decide. These decisions are made by a very small group of people in Westminster.
Well, that's their money, isn't it? The taxpayers' money that's being spent on those things.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people forget, is that we pay a huge amount of tax in this country, and it's not just the tax that we pay in terms of what comes out of our salary slips. In terms of income tax, it's all the additional taxes on top of that. Everything you buy, there's value-added tax on that as well. There's capital gains tax, there's inheritance tax, there's taxes on fuel, there's tax everywhere. So you're paying a huge amount of the money that you earn from your labor, whether it's physical or mental labor that you're generating, you're generating money. That's going to the government, and they're spending it, and they're not asking you how you'd like them to spend it. Or perhaps they argue that they do every 5 years, and if you read the manifesto, that's what you're voting for. But we all know that as soon as the government gets into power, or the party gets into government, they're pretty much going to do as they please. And we saw that with going back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of COVID. You had vast amounts of money just being simply wasted. And that's not their money, it's your money, it's my money. And that's something that people really should be alert to.
So you lead a business that's focused on international collaboration. Why is international collaboration such a good thing, and why would you encourage it in the face of growing political challenges?
Well, the world has become a much smaller place. I mean, it's tiny in comparison to how it was, let's say, 100 years ago. We're all connected. One of the great things about technology is that, for example, you can make a phone call. I've got a phone in my pocket. I can phone my daughter who lives in Dubai. I've got another daughter who's living, well, she's actually in the UK at the moment, but she's normally in Darwin in Australia. You can pick up a phone. You can have not just a phone call, but you can have a video call, and you can watch in real time what's happening on the other side of the world. Right now, it's the stuff of dreams, isn't it? I mean, if you were to go back to your parents or grandparents, I mean, they would have just looked at you in awe that was actually something that was going to be possible in our lifetime. It is a great thing, but there's a downside to it as well. But I think you do have to try and focus on the positives. The world is a very small place. We are all connected. One of the great things about travel and about being connected through technology is that you start to realize that we are just so similar, regardless of color, religion, whereabouts in the world that you've been born or brought up. Ultimately, we are just the same in many, many ways. And I think that is a good thing. But I think it also is a threat to certain groups of people or to certain establishments. There is a lot of division going on just now. There's a lot of stoking division. There's a lot of people who don't want us all to be happy together and to work together and to live together and to cooperate, because that doesn't necessarily work for those people who are wanting to profit from division. But going back to your question about in terms of international trade, I mentioned earlier about the importance of wealth creation, and the opportunities to do that are global. In order for businesses to grow and to source products from different parts of the world and to sell products in different parts of the world, that's something I think that as a capitalist, I think is something that we should pursue, and that's something that we should encourage. And that's a lot easier when there are routes to market and there aren't things, for example, like wars going on. it opens up new markets and new opportunities to create wealth. So I certainly see that as a very positive thing. What I don't like, what has definitely been happening over the last few decades, is this drive towards globalization, which maybe sounds like I'm contradicting what I've just said, but I think where you have companies that grow to such a large size that they're able to effectively monopolize business, I think that's when capitalism starts to turn quite ugly. That to me is not what capitalism was originally about. And we touched on this earlier in terms of the power of these organizations. Many of these organizations are more powerful than many governments in the world. There is no way to influence the decisions of these corporations through the electorate. These are companies that report to shareholders, not to ordinary people, and yet they have huge amounts of influence on our lives and how we go about them. And I think that is something which we've got to look very carefully at in terms of where companies start to become more powerful than governments. I think you've got a real problem. You're going into what I've described on social media as corporate communism. And I think that is something where we are now at risk of slipping into.
There's a line on your bio on X or Twitter, as it used to be known. We are defined by our compassion and kindness towards others. Our society now encourages, putting the self first and self-promotion, etc. Why do you feel our humanity towards others is such a key defining issue?
I think it's everything. I think you're right in saying how that's changed, and I think it's changed for the reasons that we've just been talking about, and that is the growth of these corporations, corporates. Because ultimately, what I see in this country, and I'm not a particularly religious person. What we have replaced, we're seeing the demise of religion, certainly in the UK, where I live. Almost every church has closed. The problem with that is that what do you replace it with? Now, what I see it being replaced with is consumerism. It's materialism. People now are enslaved to buying stuff. It's what everyone's whole aim in life is to do is to get a job so that you can afford things. Particularly things, not just things like property. In fact, most people can't afford property now. So you're looking at buying things which really, when you look at them in themselves, what's their real value to your life? I think we've got a generation now that is obsessed with things. And the reason that I think has come about is that you've got companies who have looked at the opportunities of how to make more and more profit is by selling more and more things to people, whether they need them or not. What you do is you use marketing and advertising to create this demand within the society. And you've got people now obsessed with just simply buying things. And I think it's really sad because you see so many people who are effectively enslaved because they're working simply to keep up with the Joneses, keep up with your next door neighbor in terms of what car have you got, what clothes do you wear, what all these kind of things, what phone do you have, all this kind of stuff. And the thing is that most of the people can't actually afford these things. The companies do is they make them affordable by offering credit. And I would imagine that there's an awful lot of people in this country, I would say the majority of people, who are probably up to their eyes in debt. They look at what you get once you've paid tax, which we've already talked about in terms of what you've given to the government to use whatever they want to do with that money. The rest of your money is going to big corporations. Of course they'll turn around and say, well, that's just supply and demand. That's a free market where we can charge what we want for something. But effectively, it's grabbing people's money, and what people are left with is not a lot. It does worry me that we've got this where religion is effectively being now replaced with materialism. So you've got a society now that is is becoming quite selfish, because it's looking at about like what, how do I get the things that I want for me and my family, and not looking at the wider, the broader picture of society itself. One of the great things about churches, for example, was that people got together from the local community at least once a week, simply to gather people knew each other, people knew their neighbours, people had an interest in what was happening to the old lady across the road. I suspect that an awful lot of our communities in Britain now, people don't even know their neighbours. I think that's where you start to see society as we know it starting to break down, and we start going backwards. So that is something I certainly would like to see changed.
Simon Miln, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.